After a profound loss, grief can not only feel overwhelming and endless, for some, it also really does not ease off over time. That is increasingly being referred to as, quote, prolonged grief disorder, and it's regarded as a medical condition. Does that help? And does it suggest there is, or should be, a cure for grief? Let's find out. We're joined in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Cassandra Glenn. She's a licensed master social worker. In Montreal, Quebec, Kendra McLaughlin, public health researcher, writer, and activist. In London, Ontario, Carrie Arnold, assistant professor in the thanatology department at Western's King's University College. And here in the provincial capital in Etobicoke, Carmen Galvin, co-founder of BIPOC Death and Grief Talk. And we're very glad that all four of you could spare some time for us on TVO tonight. I want to just get each of you to weigh in on the main question of the night, which is, can grief actually be cured? And then we'll go from there. Cassandra, start us off, if you would.
Sure, absolutely. My briefest answer to that question is no. It's not so cut and dry that it is something that happens and then can eventually be cured. My belief that I hold in that is that it is an experience to be integrated. It becomes part of our lives rather than something that we experience and then get over. And the ways that we learn to hold space for that and actually integrate that into our lives can make a big difference in how we move forward and make meaning out of experiences in the future.
Kendra, how would you answer that?
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I don't see grief as a disease or a disorder. I see it rather as a universal human experience that needs to have social, interpersonal, and political support.
Carrie.
I agree with what's been said so far. I think if we start to use language around grief symptoms or can grief be cured, we are then sort of supporting this current cultural narrative that grief is an illness or a disease. And we know that it isn't. And so grief isn't a biomedical sort of issue to resolve. It is a naturally occurring event in response to loss that is situated in our current socio-political norms of this time. And so I think we need to be mindful of not pathologizing or medicalizing a normative experience that all of us will encounter.
Carmen.
Yes, I 100% agree with all of the speakers. I do not believe, and we do not believe, that it is something that can be cured. It is a universal experience. What we like to tell our participants is that it is a biological imperative to creating attachments to various folks and various things. And we do not believe in pathologizing that universal experience that we all go through.
Okay, so Cassandra, I'm coming back to you now. I guess I'm seeing 4 no votes for pathologizing grief. Why do you think the attempt to do so seems to be so powerful at the moment?
Well, I think the attempt to do so seems so powerful because we really live in structures and systems that want to make things cut and dry. They want to pathologize everything. And so in that search for certainty, from making things black and white, can we give this a diagnosis? Can we make it this set of experiences that we can then get over? And because we are in such a diagnosis-centered society, there are social benefits to providing some sort of diagnosis. That doesn't come anywhere near the nuance of everybody's individual experience, particularly in grief and loss.
Kendra, needless to say, over the last 2.5 years, people have experienced grief in probably newer, more profound, and different ways than they had because of COVID-19. Can you tell us, in your view, how you think the last 2.5 years have shaped our understanding of grief?
Well, I think what it really has brought to the fore, COVID has brought to the fore, is that it is indeed a human experience, a normal human experience that increasingly more people are experiencing at the same time. And I think in a society where we're often reduced to our roles of productivity and competition, and where grief is seen as a threat to those social norms, there's a pressure to alleviate this pause on productivity that grief presents through things like diagnoses. So I think it's it's a convenient response to a time in which a lot of people are being affected in terms of productivity because of a lot of grief that is happening.
Carrie, I must confess, the word thanatology was not part of my vocabulary before I met you 5 minutes ago. You're part of the Loss Lab at the Thanatology Department at King's College University in London. This, I gather, is the study of death and losses. Can you sort of give us a better understanding of what the importance of the study of this is in academia these days?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, thanatology is the study of death, dying, grief, and loss, and comes from the Greek word thanatos. And so it holds all things related to death and grief, as well as how to live fully, knowing that our time here is finite. And so the academic study of thanatology is relatively recent, maybe starting out with Freud's sort of seminal work on mourning and melancholia. And that launched this conversation between what is depression versus grief and mourning. And so, interestingly enough, this thanatology program at King's is one of the only undergraduate programs that we know of globally. I think there are a few master's programs in the States. I don't know of any PhD programs. And so thanatology really is quite a unique discipline in that it touches all aspects of our lives. There isn't any discipline that wouldn't be affected, from green burials to medical assistance in dying, understanding suicide, palliative care, our aging population. So there are so many intersecting societal realities, even the unrest that we're seeing around the world in terms of oppressive regimes. Everything comes back to this, necropolitics. So equipping our students with how to resolve some of these or address some of these complex issues is really important.
And I think the people who run your post-secondary institution would probably like it if I called it by its proper name. I think I got it backwards there. King's University College, yes?
Yes.
There we go. Okay. I can be taught eventually. Okay, Carmen, let me get you in here now. You're the co-founder of a grassroots collective, BIPOC Grief and Death Talk. I gather you run monthly workshops on Zoom. Give us a sense of how those work and what you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of what we do is related to enfranchising disenfranchised grief within racialized communities. And what that looks like is we hold talks where we work from a perspective of decolonializing, like decolonizing, and really confronting this idea of the professional kind of helping professions, I guess. And we come together collectively as a group. We are all on the same page. We all share our stories of grief and loss. And it is a great healing space for folks who are racialized, for marginalized communities, to really have that conversation about grief, not just in the perspective of losing somebody significant, but also that we all don't live in a vacuum. We don't live in a vacuum. A lot of us are dealing with the loss of land, the loss of our abilities, especially with COVID. It's been huge, kind of long COVID, and kind of our loss of our abilities as human beings, our loss of power. Also, something we noticed during COVID was just the amount of racial trauma that was really coming out, and how that in itself cannot be separated from when we lose people, and how that can really complicate what grief looks like. And there's not enough spaces where people get to have those conversations in a space where they're not being pathologized, where they're not being spoken at, and where they feel like, okay, I'm just a patient. This is really about collective care and community support. And so that is basically our goal, is to support everyone through that.
And let me do a quick follow-up with you, because you used a word there that we are hearing more and more these days, but I'm not sure everybody knows what it means when they hear it. Decolonizing. Give us a sense about what that means and what does it look like in real life?
Yeah, so for us, it's really about confronting. So obviously, what a lot of people think decolonizing looks like would be kind of doing a land acknowledgement, and that's it. But for us, it's really about going way past the land acknowledgement. It's about acknowledging the fact that we can have these discussions and really bring in our own ancestral knowledge. For example, for myself, I am Mexican. I am an immigrant to Canada. And so we all have our own ancestral knowledge that has been really in a lot of ways taken from us quite violently. And this is a space where we can kind of talk about how do we reconnect with them? How do we reconnect with ourselves? And how do we really challenge these kind of white supremacist understandings of grief? And you can see it in policies, you can see it in bereavement leave, you can see it in all sorts of different things, how it permeates. And so our job is to sit there and let people kind of talk about their frustrations about that without trying to correct anyone, without trying to make it professional, without having to sit there and have an agenda and have, you know, breakout rooms and all these other things. It's just about people coming as they are, which we feel is very anti-colonial, because so much of colonization is just everybody having to have control over their emotions, over everything, so as to not disturb the folks around them. And so we believe in doing things a little differently.
I want to get Cassandra in on that, because you're in New Mexico right now, which is, well, you know, we haven't got time to go chapter and verse into the history of relations between settler culture and indigenous people in New Mexico, but maybe you can tell me whether what you're doing and what Carmen is doing, whether they're different.
So my background is as a social worker, and so I really believe in all of the values that Carmen is expressing. And I think that a lot of that sort of nuance that she is talking about really shows up here in New Mexico, based on all of the experiences that you've touched on. And I think that people really, I am a therapist, I am a social worker, but I also totally agree with and hear what Carmen is saying about the helping professions. Like, it can be really stuffy, and I have to work through that myself because of the way that I was trained. And especially when people are experiencing something as powerful as grief, they need a space to be for real. And I need to be able to be real with them. And that, I think, is very healing. Gotcha.
All right, we want to, I guess, pursue this angle a little more, in as much as grief does look different on everyone. And Kendra, I'm going to bring you in as much as we want to do a quote here from something you were involved with. You shared some insights for an article in Briar Patch magazine titled "The Pressure to Be Cured." And here's an excerpt from that piece. What's missing from this look at loss is what's most important: the things that kept people in grief for more than a year. For example, did the grieving person have a place to live, food, money, and friends during this challenging time? Why do they need to, quote, get over the many social and political problems that keep them in a state of grief? How does one's socioeconomic status factor into the experience of grieving? Kendra, that's for you.
Yeah, that's a great point, because socioeconomic status is basically based on your status as a worker in society and your ability to produce in society. So it relates also to what type of grief would be tolerated by your bosses and your work environment and society at large. And by that, I mean how much money and time that you would have for grieving. So this also requires a level of compliance and the expectation that this will be complemented with doctor's validation that you are indeed grieving and you need this time off. And the expectation that you will eventually suppress your grief, or that the grief will come to an end. And if there isn't this compliance to these social expectations, dependent on a person's socioeconomic status, there is the potential for job loss, for loss of support, of social status, and ultimately of shame. So in that sense, socioeconomic status has a real bearing on who can essentially afford the time to grieve.
Carrie, obviously we are talking to four women here on the program tonight, and so I suppose I should ask whether or not men and women, well, we know they grieve differently. How do they grieve differently?
This is a great question, and I think my hope is that we start to shift away from this idea of men's grief versus women's grief. Although they're different, we also know that gender is along a continuum. So I suspect that our understanding of masculine versus feminine grief will likely shift, and it needs to shift. What I can offer instead is Doka and Martin did some research a number of years ago on this idea of intuitive versus instrumental grief. And so those intuitive grievers are the ones who want to speak more about it. They might express their emotions more freely and really have a need to work through some of those pieces that we often refer to as the grief work, or some of those expressive pieces that Cassandra was saying. In terms of instrumental grievers, those are the grievers that in various theoretical models would be more, they engage in more restorative activities or rebuilding different aspects of their lives now that the person that they loved is gone, or the various losses they've experienced. They learn to adapt to them. So rather than masculine and feminine or male and female, there's this broader understanding of how people do things either through an emotional process or a restorative process. Research shows that most people will do a bit of both.
Cassandra, can you follow up on that? When you treat people, do you have to treat men differently from women when you counsel on grief?
My short answer is usually. And I also want to echo what was said about gender existing on a continuum. So I think of it more so in terms of how a person has been socialized. We live in a very socially binary world, unfortunately, still. And so someone who was socialized as male, regardless of what their gender identity is, may have been taught that it is not okay to engage with some of those more expressive pieces. And there are really deep-seated emotions about it. And someone who was socialized as female, while I think we kind of stigmatize grief in general, can have a little bit more access to those expressive parts or those emotions. And so I think of it as looking at how a person is socialized in context with where they're at, and then really figuring out what will be best in terms of developing a broader access to those emotions that need to be expressed.
Carmen, how about in your world? A difference between men and women in the way you do things?
Yes, it's actually quite interesting. So a lot of the work that we do is not just for racialized folks, but we do a lot of LGBTQ specific work. So I agree with the speakers in the sense that, yes, we can work differently for men and women. One of the things that we've noticed from our participants is that oftentimes men may take a few, meetings to really be able to open up. But regularly speaking, like, women are more open to talk about their feelings. And a lot of the questions we get is a lot of men say, I don't even know how to express what I'm feeling. And so that is something that comes up quite a bit. But again, we have quite a range of genders and gender identities. So it is quite a mix, but that is definitely a thread that goes along all of our talks. A lot of men just saying, I wasn't ever equipped or given the tools to express what this profound loss feels like for me.
Kendra, I admit I probably spend too much time in the world of politics, but in that world, if you're a male and you show emotion, even if you cry in public, nowadays it's considered quite ennobling. And if you're a woman trying to run for president and you shed a tear because something has affected you, it's often considered a deal breaker. And it's obviously there've been a lot of theories as to why Hillary Clinton was considered so unsympathetic by so many Americans. Because she didn't show emotion in public until that one time when she was running against Obama. Anyway, I'm off on a bit of a tangent there, but maybe you could jump in and talk about the double standards that we still seem to have as it relates to dealing with grief between men and women.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think it has a larger component to it in the historical understanding of women as emotional or irrational beings. So there's this expectation or maybe leeway to women expressing these emotions, but that's not as to say that women will be respected for expressing these emotions. So it's about a bit of a paradox in which they're permitted to express these emotions, but it also comes at the risk of being perceived as less rational or perhaps less serious. So in the context of grief, yes, it's true the fact that men do perhaps not allowed the space to express their emotions in the way that women would be permitted to. But I would argue that with that comes also the the prejudices against women for expressing their emotions and the expectation that they're not as rational or, in the context of politics, not as dependable.
So my sense of it, you are agreeing with my sense of the unfairness of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gotcha. All right, I want to circle back to the sort of pathologizing of grief that we talked about earlier, because earlier this year, prolonged grief disorder was officially recognized by the American Psychiatric Association as a mental health condition. And here's an excerpt from their report on this. According to the APA, symptoms of prolonged grief disorder include emotional numbness, intense emotional pain and loneliness, identity disruption, and disbelief about the person's death. The formal recognition of the disorder, so says the APA, will help medical professionals be properly reimbursed for providing medical care. It will also help researchers secure funding to research the condition. Okay, Cassandra, let me just get your take on that conclusion that the APA's come to.
Okay, well, it's certainly very nuanced. And if we are to, we certainly don't have time for a whole entire conversation about the DSM and diagnosis in general and the facts that we rely so heavily on it. However, I do want to point out that being reimbursed as someone who is speaking to people and trying to aid people in integrating these experiences for a living is a huge issue. And many insurance companies require you to provide a diagnosis in order to make a living. And so while I don't agree with labeling people and saying, this is your diagnosis in a way that is limiting to them, I do agree that there is a larger social context in which sometimes we provide diagnosis to be able to continue seeing people or for people to get benefits they need, social services, time off of work, unfortunately, things like that.
Kendra, can you weigh in on that?
Well, I think it points to a larger structural issue that we have to be labeling people and pathologizing people in order for the people who are helping them, clinicians, to help them to be able to reimburse for the work that they're doing with them. I think this points to the fact that psychotherapy should be affordable to all people, should be accessible to all people, should be free to all people, and that it shouldn't be based on the wants or the income of insurance companies to diagnose people.
Carrie, what have you found in your research, I think this would be very helpful to know, about what the difference is among people? Let's say a person loses a parent. One person, person A, can be back on the job 2 days later, functioning perfectly fine and dealing with the grief of that in their own particular way. Somebody else might need 3 months off work or more because they just cannot function with the loss of that parent. Why such a gap?
That's such a great question. And I also feel like this could be a conversation we have for many, many hours, but I'll do my best to answer briefly. When someone experiences a death-related loss for which there is this grief process, it's informed by so many other factors. As somebody mentioned on the panel already, grief doesn't occur in a vacuum. It is socially constructed by the norms and the values of what's happening at that time. And so if somebody has previous experiences with loss or different traumas in their lives that pre-existed this death experience, if there are attachment-related concerns, right? Grief is mediated through the attachment system and how people are able to form secure attachments. And so if there are insecure attachments, that may play out in their grief trajectory. Other issues such as poverty, racism, violence, other socio-political realities can also affect how someone navigates that grief trajectory. So it's not just the death of that person, but so many other factors. Have they now lost their home? Do they need to move? Is there financial strain? Are there other health-related experiences that they're dealing with at this time? And so some of those secondary losses are often more prevalent day to day in the adjustment following the death, in addition to the grief and mourning over the person who's been lost.
That really does describe very well the multi-layered differences, I guess, among different people. Yeah, we don't all start on the same starting line when somebody dies. There is so much that goes into it. And Carmen, maybe you could pick up the story and talk about the role of the community, the role of the broader community in the process of mourning and grieving.
Yeah, for sure. Well, for us, I mean, our understanding is different in the sense that, yes, we recognize that for practical reasons, the DSM will have labels for people in terms of just financial reasons. But for us, the way we see it is that community should be first for a lot of us, especially racialized folks. And I think anybody who lives in Canada can really understand that it can sometimes be irresponsible to assume that a professional should be the first person you go to when I am a social worker as well. I have my master's in social work, and I've also worked in the mental health industry, racialized mental health. And there are just such a lack of supports for folks. And so asking them to go to a professional first when that can take 18 months, when there is profound racism that occurs in the healthcare system, which we have seen in Canada, especially recently, when there is profound ableism and pathologizing of racialized people, is just not necessarily the first place you want to go to for support, nor should it be. And we believe in kind of divesting from this idea that you need to go to a professional first. And we don't discourage people from going to a psychiatrist or social worker, but we do feel that we need to have a better understanding of how we as a community can support each other. Because before there were all of these professions created, who supported grievers? We did as communities. And so let's find a way to do that. And that's really important for us, even if it means like figuring out food to drop off to people, figuring out childcare for folks. That's also something like, can we do free childcare so you can just grieve, so you don't have to be worrying about making food for your little one? Can we figure out how to kind of take care of your elderly parents while you're dealing with the loss of somebody else? How do we really support each other in this? And it's really about coming together collectively and kind of figuring out what folks need and making that kind of a network of support where we can be there for each other without expecting financial compensation for it.
Right. We're down to our last couple of minutes here, and I don't know how many of the four of you have listened to Anderson Cooper's new podcast. It's all about grief, and it's actually quite good. He was on the other day with Stephen Colbert, who, of course, a late-night CBS talk show host in the United States. And Colbert talked about losing his father and two brothers in a plane crash back in 1974. And he said, I was personally shattered, and then you kind of reform yourself in this quiet, grieving world that was created in the house. You get the awareness of other people's loss, which allows you to connect with that other person, which allows you to love more deeply and to understand what it's like to be a human being. Cassandra, we got a couple of minutes left here. Can I just get you to weigh in on the value of that advice that Stephen Colbert gave in that interview?
Yeah, I haven't listened to that yet, but now I'm excited to. I think that's a really beautiful quote. And I think he absolutely has some great insight. Like, even as a helping professional, we've had some conversations about that, so I'm putting air quotes around it. It's important for me to be in touch with the grief and the losses in my own life, to really show up for people and be able to connect with them in their experience. And it also reminds me of what Carmen was saying about the community aspect of things, and how a lot of what I'm doing is really encouraging people to get in touch with community and in touch with themselves and invest in that, because that is going to be integral to their healing process, much more so than sitting in a vacuum with me and talking forever. To really connect with those outside resources is so important.
I want to thank the four of you for sharing your tremendous wisdom with our viewers and listeners here on TVO tonight. Cassandra Glenn, Carrie Arnold, Carmen Galvin, Kendra McLaughlin. Really good of you to spend so much time with us all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.